Hello friends, and welcome to this edition of a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 3 in our study of Genesis chapter 25. And in our last lesson we left off with verse 28 of chapter 25. And we've been looking at the case of Rebekah and Isaac. And we notice where Isaac had brought a matter before the Lord. It said he entreated the Lord on Rebekah's behalf because they were without children. She was unable to have a child. And this wasn't just a one-time sporadic thing. This had been going on continuously for 20 years. For 20 years, they'd been bringing this petition before the Lord, just beseeching Him that He might allow them to have children. And so it was just an ongoing process. And we know that if something is near and dear to someone's heart, that they will continue to bring it before the Lord. Somebody might have it on their heart for the salvation of a loved one. And I've heard of cases where people have prayed for people continuously on an ongoing basis for 10, 20, 30, even 40 years or more. And they knew that it was near and dear to their heart. They wanted to see this person saved. And they knew that as long as they still had life in their bodies, as long as they were still breathing and alive on this earth, that there was still a possibility that they would accept Christ as their Savior. And so in faith, they just kept continually bringing this person's name before the Lord. And in due time, God answered their prayer and the person got saved. And so it is here with Rebekah and Isaac. We see that this was something that was near and dear to their heart. It was something that had great gravity with them, and their desire was just of such a nature that they weren't willing to give it up. Some people would give up maybe after 5 or 6 years. They'd say, well, I guess it just isn't meant to be. I guess it's just not the Lord's will. But in their case, they weren't willing to give up. They were just continually entreating the Lord that He might allow them to have children. And so for 20 years, they brought this matter before the Lord. And we can't really fathom the Lord's timing in certain matters. We don't know the exact mind of the Lord. The best thing we can do is just to go forward in faith and recognize that God is sovereign and that His will be done, but it'll be done in His own timing. And sometimes it's hard to grasp onto that, especially when things aren't moving as fast or moving in the right, the direction that we think they should go in. And if we're not careful, we might take matters into our own hands and kind of mess things up more or less. And so unlike what Abraham did, when Abraham, he hearkened unto his wife and they got impatient and they wanted to have a child and they didn't wait upon the Lord, and he got the secondary wife there in Hagar and they had children by her, and we know the story there. But unlike Abraham, Isaac was going to stay the course. He was going to stay the course, and in faith, he was simply going to trust in God's sovereignty and in God's timing, and just trust it to the Lord. Trust the matter to the Lord. If it was God's will that they would have children, then God would make it happen. And so that's what they did. He wasn't going to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to resort to alternative means, but he was simply going to wait and be patient and rely upon the Lord's will. And he didn't strive to have a child with a handmaid. He didn't do things like that and take after his father. But he waited upon the Lord's resolve and trusted His all-sufficiency for supply. And likewise, he did not leave off praying for the situation. And what do we see? Well, it would simply not be a child when God answered, and it said that God heard his prayer. And God was entreated of Isaac, and He responded and opened Rebekah's womb and allowed her to have a child. But it wouldn't simply be a child, but we're going to notice here that it would be twins. It was going to be twins. And Rebekah was just slightly perplexed at her current situation. Because we notice, what did the Bible say? It says the children struggled within her. And what was her response? If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. If this be of the Lord, if this be our answered prayer, And if I have conceived and am with child, then why am I experiencing this apparent turmoil within me? Is there a problem? Is there something that's not right? Why am I experiencing this upheaval and apparently some infightings? And why is there not, why is there unrest and not peace within my womb? If it's of the Lord, then why am I not at peace, and why do I not have peace within the situation? I mean, what is the meaning of this? Well, she went to inquire of the Lord and hopefully get a meaningful answer to her question. Now, did she take the matter directly to the Lord? Did she take her case before the high priest? Even perhaps Melchizedek? Or perhaps through other means? Well, we don't know for sure. But what we do know is that she did, in fact, put the matter before the Lord. Because she knew the best way that she would get the best answer, the most direct answer, and the exact, outcome of her question was because she could trust, God's Word. And if she could get the answer from the Lord, then she would know exactly what the meaning of this was. And one thing that also must be noted here is though Isaac had prayed for this mercy very often, and though he had continued his supplication many years, and it was not granted, yet he did not leave off praying for it. For men ought always to pray and not to faint, as it tells us in Luke chapter 18 and verse 1. They're to pray without ceasing and knock until the door, or until the answer to the door is given. He prayed for his wife. He prayed over his wife. He prayed with his wife. And he prayed on behalf of his wife. He entreated the Lord for her. And according to Jewish tradition, Isaac took his wife with him to Mount Moriah, where God had promised that he would multiply Abraham's seed, and there, in his prayer with her and for her, pleaded the promise made in that very place. So, that's a good thing to do. If there's a place where God has moved upon us in the past, or maybe there's a place that God met with us in the past in a special place, and maybe there's something that was started in that place. It could have been the moment of salvation. It could have been the moment of a calling. It could have been the moment of an answered prayer. Whatever the case is. If there's something else that's come into your life, it might not be a bad thing to go back to that place. Back to that origination point. And therewith try to meet with the Lord again in that special place. I've gone back to churches that I've attended before, and those were special places. There were special things that happened there. We had special times there. We had special fellowship with people there. And it's a good thing to go back to that place. And once again, just rekindle that spirit that was there. And renew those vows that might have been made there. And maybe just go to that place and pray once again where you prayed maybe 20 years ago. And now you're sitting maybe in that same pew, or that same corner, at that same altar, and praying once again. And what a special time that is. But it's also an occasion to bring back those memories and to just show the seriousness of the matter before the Lord. And say, Lord, I'm reaffirming those promises that were made. I'm reminding you of these things that I had been instructed of. And I'm just rekindling that spirit that took place here years ago with my father Abraham. And I just want to bring my wife here and bring her before you and place this petition before you in this special holy place. And so perhaps that is what happened. And, this is where God had met with Abraham. And, so God heard his prayer. And multiplied it would be. For in her womb was not one, but 2 children. It was going to be a double blessing. And not only 2 children, but 2 sons. And thusly we see how she is perplexed about the current situation. What does she say? She asks kind of a special question. She says, if it be so, why am I thus? for the children struggled within her. Which again exposes this concept of abortion for the fallacy, for the untruth, for the ignorance, and just for the evil that concept really is. It exposes it for what it is. I mean, it's very apparent. I mean, people today will deny it, they'll avoid it, they'll shun it, and they'll try to explain it away. I mean, this concept of abortion, it's an evil thing. It's murder. And people will try to hide it under the guise of women's rights, under the guise of women's health. In other words, it's all about the woman. It's all about her welfare. It's all about doing good on her behalf. It's all about meeting her needs. And they just focus and shower all of the attention on the woman with no regard for the child whatsoever. But here we can see clearly that all of that just gets kicked to the wind immediately. Because what does it say? It says that, it doesn't say that the cells struggled within her. It doesn't say that lumps of flesh struggled within her. It doesn't say that the fetuses struggled within her. No, what does it say? It says the children struggled with. I mean, the Bible makes it very clear that these unborn people, these unborn human beings that are still within the womb, they're already, in God's eyes, they're already considered children because they are children. And at the moment of conception, even by our own government's definition, I've looked it up, I've researched it, and if I can find that reference again, I'm going to take a picture of it and make it apparent. But by our own government's definition, it says when those cells meet together, it says a new life form is created, a new organism. Because it's no longer two separate cells, but now it's a new organism. That new organism is a human being. It's a child in its infancy. And the Bible makes it very clear here. There's throughout the Bible, throughout the Scriptures, you'll see that the Bible describes the person within the womb, a child, and there's great things that happen while those children are in the womb. Sometimes they are given names. Sometimes they're called out. Sometimes they've already got their futures planned out before they even are born. And so it's just a very evil concept, and it's a concept that's really hard to understand and hard to even fathom why it even exists, why people even think that way. And yet here we are in our own country, we're having people that are not only promoting it, but they're fighting for those rights to have abortions. And so it's just a hard thing to understand, but what we do understand about it is that it's wicked, it's evil, and it's murder. That's what it is in a nutshell. And the internal commotion that Rebecca felt here was pretty extraordinary and made her feel very uneasy. And so she just, they didn't have medical teams to try to explain things. They didn't have a hospital you could run down and get an ultrasound on and see what's going on. They didn't have, MRIs, and they just didn't have any of that available. And so she's got this struggling. I mean, we know that children kick in the womb, and they move around in the womb, but she was feeling a struggle going on here between these two children. And of course, she didn't know. She didn't know she was going to have twins. She didn't know she had two babies in there. She just knew that there was something going on that didn't feel right. And so the internal commotion that she felt was very extraordinary. She wondered if everything was all right. And God had given her these children, or given her this child at this point, and apparently she was having some sort of issues. And after all, if they're not even born yet and already aren't getting along, well, what would that be all about? Could this be a precursor of future events? Is this what I'm in for? I mean, will I be able to handle this situation? Well, no one on earth could answer these questions for her. And so she went to inquire of the Lord, which is the right thing that she should be doing. And the answer is provided. What does the Bible say? You know, God tells her that 2 nations are in thy womb. Not only are you going to have twins, Rebecca, not only did these represent 2 sons, but the heads of 2 nations. Wow. What an extraordinary explanation. What a great announcement to get. To know that before your children are even born that they're going to be the heads of nations. And so this would be quite some breaking news for sure. And their manners and their dispositions would differ greatly. Their interests would contend and clash one with another. And it would result in the older serving the younger, which was basically unheard of. It was an unheard of arrangement. And to prove it even further, they were even greatly different in appearance at their birth. So already we know that there's going to be contention between these 2 nations, and it's even being proven out in the womb. And they're fighting for the birthright, you might say. They're fighting for the birthright. And we're going to see that not only that, but their appearance is going to be very differentiated at the moment of birth. What does it tell us? It says the first was going to be named Esau. He was rough and hairy all over, and so much hair it was akin to a garment. Now that's one hairy kid. I mean, I've seen kids get born with extraordinary amount of hair, maybe even a full head of hair, but not hair all over like that. And so this would be an indication of a very strong constitution and attitude, and that he would be very robust, very daring, and a very active individual. But on the other hand, the other child, who would be Jacob, how is he described? He was described as being smooth and tender, as most children would expect to be. This would be their natural dispositions that would invariably define their personalities and occupations. And so now we notice the outcome of their struggle. Esau was born first, but as he entered this world, what does it tell us? It says that Jacob grabbed onto his heel. Jacob wasn't willing to give in. And this, in essence, signified Jacob's pursuit of the birthright and blessing. From the very first, he reached forth to take hold of it, and if possible, to prevent his brother. His prevailing for it at last, that in process of time, he should undermine his brother and gain his point. And thusly, he would eventually become known as Jacob the supplanter. And that's why, the Bible tells us that the elder would end up serving the younger. So the temperament of their minds and their nature of living would be quite contrary as well. Esau would become a hunter and a man who would live to learn by his wits. Recreation would become his business. And he was a man of the field. He was a rugged man, a warrior, and a cunning hunter. Jacob, on the other hand, was a plain man, dwelling in tents, an honest man that always meant well and dealt fairly and preferred more or less the delights of solitude or being on his own. He was a shepherd by trade, an educated and refined individual compared to Esau. And it would end up being on this man that the covenant would eventually be bestowed by Isaac, as we're going to see in upcoming scriptures. And so there we see the home relationships, just like in modern families, certain children can gain certain affections more so from one parent than the other for various reasons. What does it tell us? It says that Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Isaac loved the ruggedness of Esau, a man's man by all accounts. And he loved the fruit of his labors, fresh meat from the field, in particular the dish that was made with the venison. But Rebekah, on the other hand, reached out with a mother's tender and loving care, and she recognized that it was Jacob that had received the blessing or the oracle of God. Therefore, he was to be preferred and selected. And he was to be the primary that God had chosen, and it would be her first choice as well. Well, with that we see, it brings us to verses 29 to 34. And here we read, "And Jacob sod pottage." So, the boys have been born. They've been raised. We see the differences there. We see the, how they were brought up. And we see that even between the parents, they both had their favorites. Esau was Isaac's favorite and Jacob was Rebekah's favorite. So already there was some conflict within the family, I'm sure. And the way they were treated and the way they were responded to, maybe in some of the duties they were given, some of the awards, or if you will, or some of the accolades they received from their parents in different ways. And so there was just some kind of butting heads there already. And even between the parents, perhaps, on who was going to be the one to get the birthright, who was going to be the one to get the blessing. And we know who rightfully, by human standards, would have been in line for it, would have been Esau. But Rebekah saw something different in the two, and she recognized that God's blessing to her seemingly was already resting upon Jacob. And so as the boys grew, and as they got older, we see here in verse 29 that Jacob sod pottage. He was making some soup. He was making some stew. And Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, "Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint." Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me this day." And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and rose up, and went his way. And Esau despised his birthright. So here we're made aware of another unique situation. We have here the account of a bargain that is made between the two brothers, the twins, the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. It would be concerning the birthright, which is under normal circumstances would naturally be entitled to the elder brother Esau. However, in this instance, the birthright was Esau's by providence, but it was Jacob's by promise, because back in verse 23, we already read that the Lord related that the elder shall serve the younger. So it was already foretold that this was not going to be a typical case of hierarchy within the family group. And what was the advantage of a birthright? Well, it was literally a spiritual privilege. It included the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power, as well as the double portion that would be received from the parent. It was not to be taken lightly, and it was something to be cherished and held on to. But we notice the setting here. What do we see? Well, Esau had been out in the field working his nose to the grindstone, you might say. Whether he was hunting, whether he was gathering, maybe he was trying to bring back some fresh meat that day. He'd been out in the hot sun all day. Maybe he didn't have adequate water. He didn't have enough provisions with him. Obviously, he didn't take enough beef jerky or whatever to keep him supplied adequately. And it was a long walk back home, especially if you came back empty-handed. And he may have had sunstroke. Maybe he was just dehydrated. Maybe he was just really, really feeling bad at this point. And so he'd been out there. He was hot, he was sweaty, he was weak. And what does it tell us? He was famished. And literally he was feeling faint because of it. And if you've ever been in that position, it's a really bad feeling when you're dried out, you're dehydrated, and you're just about to pass out. And he smelled a fragrant aroma immediately upon coming upon the house. And Jacob was in the kitchen cooking. He was cooking a favorite meal of the family, and that was what they called pottage. It was some type of a soup with lentils in it, and it was perhaps maybe even like a stew. And he requested, Esau did, a meal of his brother. I mean, he couldn't take it. He was starving to death in his own mind. He was at the point of death in his own mind. He was famished, and wow, now this fresh aroma of this cooking food on the fire just filled his senses. And so in his mind, it was a matter of life and death. And his appetite at this point was overwhelming. And so Jacob, here's Jacob out there fixing his own meal, fixing his own dinner perhaps. And obviously Esau had come back empty-handed and now wanted to kind of horn in on Jacob's meal. And he wanted either he wanted all of it or at least a fair share. And so he was begging Jacob. What was he begging him for? He says, some of that red pottage. And in fact, after this incident takes place, this would literally become a reproach to him for this incident because of what he did as a result of desiring this red pottage so intensely that his nickname would literally become Edom, which stood for red. So he'd be called Red from that point on. Well, he was in such a state that he wasn't even able to feed himself. I mean, that's how weak he was. So we're going to pick it up there in our next lesson, and we're going to see the outcome of this. Now here you can just imagine the scene that Jacob's in there just doing his daily duties. He's cooking up a meal, fresh hot meal. Here comes Esau busting through the door, just looking like he's half death rolled over. I mean, he's all pale looking. He's all sweaty. He can barely stand up, barely keep his senses together. And he's literally begging on bended knee, if you will, that Jacob would give him something to eat. And so Jacob now kind of has an opportunity. He sees an opportunity here. Jacob is an opportunist. That's what he's known for. He's called Jacob the supplanter. And so we're going to see how he's going to respond to Esau and use this situation as a bargaining chip to get what he wants. And so we'll see that in our next lesson. Hope you stay with us. Hope you're having a great day, and we'll talk to you then.